Yo, what up YouTube, man? It's your boy, man. I apologize. I've been a little bit AFK for a couple days, man. I've been working on my game channel, link in the description, link in the bio. I've been trying to get my simulation set up already for American Truck Simulator and everything. That channel is about to be fire. I've been gaining a little bit of a loyal audience there, so happy to see it go and get started blowing up, and hopefully we can finally get this channel over 1,000. So we're gonna go ahead and jump right into this video. I got a couple more I'm gonna drop after this one. Try to get caught back up on what we've been slacking. I lost a couple subscribers, but that's all right. We'll gain them back, no big deal. The janitor who becomes kingpin and made a biggest cartel heist ever. To me, that's pretty fucking interesting. So I'm gonna go ahead and jump right into it. This 34-minute video. Stay tuned to the end. Drop a like, comment, subscribe if you ain't already. We're gonna go ahead and smoke, you know. But we're gonna have to keep it on the low. YouTube be a pain in the ass sometimes. But yeah, we're gonna go ahead and start this up real quick.
3:17 a.m. on a fog-covered rural road in Mexico. A single truck cuts through the darkness, carrying $6 million in cartel cash to a money laundering operation across the border. In exactly 14 minutes, Luis Alvarez will execute the most perfect heist in cartel history. He'll steal $6 million, disappear without a trace, and frame 4 innocent men for his crime. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. The cartel will never know they were robbed by their own janitor. They'll torture and murder the wrong people, destroy innocent families, and never suspect that the man who cleaned their blood off the floors was the same man who stole their money. This is the true story of the perfect crime and the terrible price of perfection. How far would you go to escape poverty? And what happens when the perfect plan has the most imperfect consequences? Let me take you back to where it all began.
Oof, just diving deep into a story.
2 years before that foggy night, Luis Alvarez was nobody. Literally, nobody. At 34 years old, he was the kind of person society had trained itself not to see. A janitor in a cartel-controlled territory, earning 200 pesos a day, roughly $11, to clean the offices where millions of dollars changed hands every week. Luis had worked for the Hermanos Negros cartel for 18 months, mopping floors, emptying trash, fixing broken equipment. To the cartel members, he was furniture, invisible, forgettable. But furniture has eyes, and furniture has ears. During his first year, Luis heard everything. While cleaning the boss's office, he'd overhear phone conversations about money transfers. While fixing air conditioning units, he'd listen to logistics meetings. While emptying ashtrays, he'd absorb details about routes, schedules, and security procedures. The conversation that changed his life happened on a Tuesday in October, while he was cleaning the windows in the main conference room. Luis heard the operations manager explaining a recurring problem. Their Tuesday night cash runs through Campo Nuevo were completely unguarded. Clean operations, minimal security, but with a deadly catch, drivers kept disappearing. Some were killed by rivals, others by their own paranoia. A few simply vanished into the night with the money. The manager laughed as he explained their solution. Pay drivers $500 per run, but expect them to be dead within 3 trips. It was cheaper than hiring security. Luis continued cleaning, his expression never changing. But inside, his mind was calculating. $6 million. Every Tuesday, minimal security, dead drivers. What if the next driver simply disappeared differently? But Luis wasn't a criminal. He was a janitor with a 6th grade education who'd never stolen anything larger than office supplies. How could someone like him rob a cartel? The answer came 8 months later when fate handed him the key to everything.
Okay. What fate tell you, Mister?
In June of the following year, one of the cartel's technical specialists called in sick during a critical system upgrade. The surveillance equipment was malfunctioning, and they needed anyone who understood basic electronics. Someone pointed to Luis. The janitor had fixed their Wi-Fi before, hadn't he? Luis nodded quietly. He taught himself computer repair from YouTube videos during his spare time, practicing on discarded equipment. It was a hobby, nothing more. But as he worked on the surveillance system, Luis realized he'd been handed something far more valuable than money: access. The cartel's entire digital infrastructure ran through a central server. Cameras, GPS tracking, communication logs, financial records, everything was connected. and now Luis had administrative access to all of it. For the next 6 months, Luis became the cartel's unofficial IT support. Every technical problem, every camera malfunction, every network issue they called the janitor. He was reliable, quiet, and completely invisible. What they didn't know was that Luis was documenting everything. Every password, every system vulnerability, every piece of digital evidence that flowed through their network. He learned about money pickup schedules 3 weeks in advance. He knew which routes had security and which didn't. He could access real-time GPS data from every vehicle in their fleet. Most importantly, he learned how to manipulate their surveillance system, how to loop camera feeds, how to insert false timestamps, how to make digital evidence show whatever he wanted it to show. Luis was no longer just a janitor. He was a digital ghost, moving invisibly through their electronic systems, learning their secrets, preparing for something they could never imagine. But knowledge without action is worthless. Luis needed more than access. He needed a plan. And that plan began taking shape in his small, dark room, under the light of a single lamp. What followed were 18 months of meticulous preparation that would have impressed military strategists and terrified psychiatrists. If you could have seen Luis's apartment in December of that year, you would have thought you'd walked into the mind of a madman or a genius. Every wall was covered with maps, schedules, photographs, and flowcharts. Red string connected dates to locations, routes to personnel, patterns to opportunities. It looked like the workspace of a detective hunting a serial killer, not a janitor planning a robbery. But Luis wasn't crazy. He was methodical. The turning point came when Luis was cleaning a loading bay late at night when the bucket slipped from the ledge. 40 pounds of metal and water smashed down across his right hand. The pain was instant, sharp, numbing, hot. The next morning, the cartel sent him to a cheap, private clinic on the edge of town. They didn't want him missing shifts, so he sat there in a plastic chair, cradling his hand, waiting for a doctor who was running 40 minutes behind. The television in the lobby was old, flickering, mounted high on the wall. It was showing a documentary rerun, one of those grainy true crime specials narrated in a low, serious voice. The 1,978 Lufthansa heist, JFK Airport. Over $5 million in cash stolen, never recovered. Luis wasn't paying attention at first, but then came the line. In every great heist, the real genius isn't the one who steals the money. It's the one smart enough to make someone else take the fall. Luis looked up. The documentary explained how the real masterminds never got caught. They let the foot soldiers rot in prison or disappear. They didn't just steal, they erased themselves from the story. That night, Luis couldn't sleep. He replayed that phrase over and over in his mind. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about after the money, about who would be blamed.
Yeah, see, now he's thinking.
By dawn, he had a new plan, one more dangerous, more brilliant than anything he'd imagined before.
Most people, they don't think that far. They think about, oh, I'm gonna get the money, this is how I'm gonna do it. Let's go ahead and get it done, you know? And then they get the money and they're like, oh, fuck, now I'm fucked up, I got 5 stars, I'm wanted, run, you know? And then they don't make it far. Man, thinking it all out, it's a process.
He opened a clean page in his notebook and wrote 2 words: scapegoat, redirection. The robbery would happen, but someone else would pay for it. The next few weeks were obsessive. He stole personnel files one by one and spread them out on his bed. He took notes in a stolen ledger, assigning threat scores, psychological traits, personal risks. He wasn't looking for flaws, he was looking for stories. Stories that would make someone look guilty. Carlos Vega showed up by accident. One night, while taking out the trash behind the building, Luis noticed a familiar car parked across the street. Inside Carlos, in the passenger seat, a woman, young, pretty, definitely not his wife. They were kissing, fast, nervous. Luis lingered a second longer than he should have. Not because he was shocked, but because something about it didn't add up. He didn't know who she was, or why Carlos was with her, but he latched onto it. Sometimes, all it takes to break a man is one crack. Luis had just found one. Now, he just had to follow it. Next came Mario Guerrero. Luis had seen him a few times near the smoking area behind the warehouse, always pacing, always jittery, like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. One night, while emptying the bins, Luis overheard Mario talking on the phone. He kept repeating the same line. "The money's coming, I swear. Just a few more days." His voice cracked halfway through. Luis didn't know who was on the other end, or what the debt was about, but he didn't need to. Fear like that had a shape, and once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Luis made a quiet mental note. Not a target yet, but worth watching. Then there was Fernando Silva. Luis kept running into him in the oddest places, hallways, loading zones, break rooms, and every time Fernando had questions. Too many questions. Why are we changing the shift schedule? Who signed off on the new route? Where exactly is this money going? He wasn't loud, just persistent. Luis once overheard him in the locker room grilling a supervisor for 10 straight minutes about a missing shipment report. That night, Luis wrote his name in a notebook and circled it twice in red. Next to it, he scribbled, "Too many questions." Then there was Ricardo Morales. Too perfect, always early, always quiet, always followed the rules. Among a crew full of screw-ups, men who drank too much, gambled too often, skipped steps just to get home faster, Ricardo stood out. He didn't party. He didn't slack off. He did everything by the book. And that, in a place like this, was its own kind of suspicious. Luis noticed it, wrote his name down, underlined it. Sometimes, the ones who don't fit in are the ones people start whispering about. But the final piece was different. Gustavo Herrera, the kind of man no one suspects. He brought lunch from home, prayed before meals, called his wife after every route. Too perfect. Luis had almost moved on, until he saw the line in the medical report, chronic anxiety, prescription, Zolpidem. He exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he just stared at the ceiling fan. Then he stood up, walked over to the wall where all the threads were pinned: drivers, routes, dates, habits, and stood silently in front of it, not moving, just thinking. Luis lit a cigarette, then another. By the time the sun rose, he hadn't moved. But in his mind, the story had already begun. And these men, Carlos, Mario, Fernando, even Gustavo, they were no longer co-workers. They were pieces, and he was ready to arrange them. Luis didn't own a laptop. He didn't carry a smartphone. He barely finished the 6th grade. But he had two things most men in that warehouse didn't: patience and invisibility. No one notices the janitor. That was his power. While they laughed, smoked, argued, bragged, Luis was sweeping in the background, listening, collecting. And once he had the name circled in red, he began the slow, silent work of turning suspicion into certainty. Carlos Vega. He started with Carlos. The kiss had been fast, but the woman's face stuck in Luis's mind. A week later, while waiting in line at a small pharmacy 2 blocks from the depot, he saw her again, same lips, same sunglasses, same nervous energy. She stepped out of a house next door, digging in her purse, and something fell to the ground. Luis didn't move at first, but after she drove away in the same Nissan Carlos always drove, he walked over. It was her ID, a Mexican license. Her name, Jimena Rodriguez de Lira. Luis froze. That last name, de Lira, wasn't common. It belonged to Federico de Lira, an enforcer for the Valle del Sur cartel. He remembered the name from a whispered story 2 months ago in the break room. Someone had mentioned de Lira beat a man with a crowbar for texting his wife. Now Luis had just found the wife. He kept the name. And the story, Mario Guerrero. Mario was harder. He didn't leave clues, he leaked anxiety. But Luis had seen enough panicked men to recognize the patterns. So he watched. He mopped slowly near the smoking area, where Mario always paced, muttering to himself. He started showing up there at the same time every shift, lingering by the bins. One night, he overheard enough to confirm it. "The money's coming, I swear. Don't do anything stupid. Just wait." The call ended with Mario nearly in tears. The next day, Luis quietly asked one of the younger drivers, "That Mario guy, what's his deal?" The answer came with a snort. "Guy blew half his paychecks at the Casino Azul in Jalisco. Owes serious money, I heard. Stupid bastards got death on a timer." Luis didn't ask again. He didn't need to. Fernando Silva. With Fernando, Luis barely had to dig. The man talked too much, questioned everything. But the key wasn't Fernando's mouth, it was how everyone else reacted to it. Luis started sweeping closer when Fernando spoke. He noticed how supervisors tensed, how drivers rolled their eyes, how security shifted in their seats. Then one afternoon in the loading bay, Luis heard 2 guards whispering near a stack of crates. "If that Silva asshole keeps pushing, he's gonna disappear." Boss already flagged him, asking about routing protocols like he's DEA. Luis didn't even blink. He just kept sweeping, turned the corner, and wrote Fernando's name twice in his notebook. This time, no question marks. Ricardo Morales. Ricardo was the strange one. Too polite, too clean, never late, never loud, never careless. While others cursed or joked or got drunk after work, Ricardo walked straight to the bus stop and went home. That's what made him dangerous. Then one evening, while Luis was restocking soap in the men's bathroom, Ricardo walked in and started venting not to Luis, but more to himself. "They think I'm trying too hard," he muttered, "just because I don't screw around like the rest of them. I'm the only one doing things right, and all I get is silence. I'm invisible to them." Then he looked at Luis, suddenly realizing he wasn't alone, and said, "You get it. You're just a janitor. You do your job. No one sees it." He washed his hands, shook his head, and left. Luis stood there for a full minute, motionless, then walked to the corner, opened his notebook, and wrote down, "Ricardo Morales, too perfect. Wants to be seen." That was it. That was enough. By the end of the month, Luis had built his internal case file. 4 men, 4 stories. Not lies, just vulnerabilities. All he had to do now was connect the right evidence to the right crack. He didn't need hackers or police records. He had brooms, overheard gossip, street memory, and instincts sharpened by years of being ignored. This wasn't just a robbery anymore. It was a stage, and the roles had already been cast.
Damn.
The night after Luis finalized his list, the 4 men he would frame, he found himself in a cantina on the southern edge of Reynosa. The place was almost empty. A flickering television played a football match nobody watched. The bartender poured beer like time didn't matter. Luis sat alone with a warm drink, staring at the wall, thinking. For the first time in months, his thoughts weren't on how to steal. They were on how to disappear. The heist was only half the plan. The rest, the part that really mattered, was making sure Luis Alvarez died that night too. Quietly. Without a trace. But how does a janitor vanish? He had no access to hackers, no corrupt officials. No one owed him favors. He wasn't a smuggler or a soldier or a man with resources. He was just the guy who mopped the floors. And then by accident, he heard something. 2 men were talking at the table behind him. Low voices, careful words. One of them mentioned documents. Clean scans, multiple IDs, and a name that stuck, El Artista. Luis didn't turn around. He didn't breathe. He just listened, memorized the details, let the name settle into his bones. When one of the men left, Luis waited a full minute, then got up and offered the other man a drink. No questions, just presence. Something about his quiet intensity must have worked, because by the time the second beer was done, Luis had a meeting place and a time. A week later, in the back of a shuttered auto shop on the outskirts of Mexico City, he met the man behind the name. No real introductions, no handshakes. El Artista didn't ask who Luis was or why he needed to disappear. He simply got to work. His movements were clean, practiced, part craftsman, part surgeon. Luis explained what he needed. A life that had never worked for the cartel, never lived in Reynosa, and had just enough digital noise to seem boring and real. For 15,000 pesos quietly siphoned over months from inflated janitorial invoices, he got it. Name, Ricardo Salinas. Origin, a town in Tamaulipas where the municipal archives had burned down in 2017. Background, school records from a closed high school. Job history from a now defunct trucking company. Noise, 2 parking violations, a small unpaid loan, a gas bill, just enough to show up on second-rate databases. 2 weeks later, Luis held a fresh Mexican passport and a valid U.S. driver's license, both under his new identity. He also received a USB stick filled with PDFs, scanned records, Idaho backups, certificates, the kind of details only a bureaucrat would check. He stared at them that night under a flickering bulb in his apartment. The heist hadn't happened yet, but the man who would pull it off, he already didn't exist.
Hell yeah.
Let's go back to the day Luis read Gustavo's medical file. He wasn't looking for weakness. He was looking for a story he could weaponize. And there it was, a quiet sentence tucked away at the bottom. Medical leave, chronic anxiety, prescription, Zolpidem. Luis stopped reading. His thoughts froze not from confusion, but from clarity. Sedatives, that changed everything. It meant Gustavo was already living under chemical control. He didn't need to be scared, threatened, or bribed. He just needed to be put to sleep. Luis stared at the file for over an hour that night, and as the idea settled into his mind, It no longer felt like a detail. It felt like the plan. But theory wasn't enough. Luis needed a way to do it silently, quickly, without leaving a mark. He started digging. First, he called his cousin, a veterinary assistant outside Monterey. He pretended to be writing a screenplay, asking questions about animal surgeries. What kind of gas do you use to sedate dogs? Is it fast? Does it smell? Could a person even notice it? The cousin answered without hesitation. Isoflurane, works every time. Luis wrote the word down and circled it 3 times. That night, he stayed up reading veterinary textbooks and biology PDFs. He didn't just want the name, he wanted control. He learned that isoflurane was a colorless, non-flammable gas used in surgeries. In low concentrations, it was nearly odorless. It worked fast. It wore off cleanly. But most importantly, it could be administered through a ventilation system. Perfect. But he still needed to test it. Luis started showing up to his cousin's clinic unannounced, offering to help clean cages or organize supplies. Each visit gave him another excuse to observe procedures, take notes, even sneak supplies. After 2 weeks, he had a full sketch of how the gas worked. But sketches weren't enough. He rented an abandoned warehouse outside town, no cameras, no neighbors. And there, he began to test it. Not on people. Not yet. On animals. At first, it was rats. He'd put them in sealed containers, monitor how long they stayed awake. Then came cats. Then dogs. It wasn't science. It was rehearsal. Each time an animal collapsed, Luis didn't flinch. He took notes, adjusted the concentration, watched, waited, and each test made the next easier. He wasn't just studying chemistry, he was studying himself. He learned that 3% isoflurane, fed through a vehicle's AC system, would knock out an adult male in about 90 seconds. He also built a small delivery device, no larger than a phone, matte black, controlled remotely. He tested it in trucks from a junkyard, tweaking airflow, timing, and remote range. By the end of the 3rd week, Luis had a working system, a gas that could sedate, a machine that could deliver, and a conscience that no longer objected. But the real discovery wasn't technical. It was internal. Luis realized he could cross moral lines as long as the story in his head justified it. He wasn't hurting people. He was perfecting the plan. He wasn't torturing animals. He was eliminating uncertainty. And when he looked at Gustavo's name again, he didn't see a man anymore. He saw a variable, a problem with a chemical solution. By the time Luis finished his last animal test, the blueprint was final. There was no more doubt, no more sketches, no more trial and error. Everything was ready. He knew exactly where he'd intercept Gustavo's truck, a blind curve near Campo Nuevo, where even cartel spotters went off duty for coffee. He knew when 3:03 a.m. on the next scheduled Tuesday run, same route, same driver, no security escort, no questions asked. He knew how 3% isoflurane through the AC vent. Gustavo would fall asleep before he even realized something was wrong. But taking out the driver was only half the job. Luis needed to move the money quietly, quickly, and without drawing attention. That meant no helicopters, no convoys, no drama, just extraction. In a rundown shed 20 minutes off route, he'd hidden the next phase. A 1,994 Nissan Suru, sun-bleached and battered, the kind of car people look through, not at. Rear seats ripped out, suspension reinforced, license plates stolen from a matching junk model 2 states away. He had test-driven it twice with full weight in the trunk. 12 waterproof duffel bags of cartel cash would fit barely. From there, the road south would be clean. Luis had picked every turn, every gas station, every blind spot. No surveillance, no digital footprint. No one who would remember the face of a quiet man driving a forgettable car. And then, not a checkpoint, not a tunnel, something smarter, quieter. Luis had considered the smuggling tunnel months ago, even reinforced its old exit near Reynosa with scrap steel. But that plan had holes, heat signatures, cartel lookouts, collapsible ground. Too risky. Instead, he chose a different route, the one few dared. The smuggler's corridor near Camargo. 8 kilometers of thick brush, unpatrolled and fog-covered, leading straight to a forgotten ranch road in Texas. He'd mapped it 24 times on foot, buried markers, timed the walk, counted how long Border Patrol drones took to loop back. It was quiet, too quiet. The plan was in motion. The tools were ready. The story was perfect. Now all he had to do was press start. Luis Alvarez stood alone on the edge of the highway, shrouded in fog and darkness. Just beyond the bend near Campo Nuevo, His backpack was zipped, gloves on. A fake cartel uniform clung to his frame, stiff and freshly pressed. 2 years of planning had led to this moment. In less than an hour, he would either be a ghost with $6.2 million or a corpse with a story no one would hear. But the setup had begun weeks earlier. 2 weeks before the heist, Luis started building what looked like an official cartel checkpoint. He bought 4 red traffic cones off a construction worker in the city, an old LED floodlight, a collapsible stop for inspection, sign painted crudely but convincingly in Spanish, a flashing strobe light meant to mimic cartel emergency beacons. All of it cheap, all of it believable, especially in the dark. He knew the exact spot where he'd stage it, a narrow gravel shoulder near a bend in the road just outside Campo Nuevo. It was a place where GPS signals often dropped, and cartel drivers were used to random inspections. Rumors floated around about occasional theft and smuggling from within, so these surprise checkpoints didn't raise suspicion anymore. If anything, drivers were conditioned to comply without asking questions. Luis had chosen this place for a reason. No cameras, no overhead lights, no witnesses, just fog, dirt, and routine fear. At 2:52 a.m., Luis arrived and began setting it all up. The cones went down first, forming a crooked lane across the road. The fake warning sign leaned against a metal post. He mounted the strobe light on the roof of a parked maintenance truck he'd borrowed and covered the license plates. A dim lantern hung from a hook behind him, casting just enough light to create authority, but not enough to expose him. Then he waited. 2:58 a.m. A repurposed diagnostic tool he'd quietly stolen months earlier, the day they let him into the server room to fix a network fault. No one noticed it was gone. At home, Luis had rewired the device himself, step by step, using old cartel schematics and YouTube tutorials on relay spoofing. Now it pulsed once in his palm. The GPS feed on Gustavo's truck froze instantly, a digital illusion of a routine 6-minute smoke break. Nothing strange, no alarms, just another blip on a route where signals often cut out anyway. No one would question it, and that was the brilliance. 3:03 a.m. Headlights cut through the mist. The truck appeared, slowing naturally at the sight of the cones and the flashing light. Luis stepped forward, clipboard in hand, radio clipped to his shoulder. His uniform was spotless, his posture confident. He didn't wave, didn't shout, just stood firm like someone whose authority didn't need explaining. Routine checkpoint, he said in a calm practice voice. Gustavo didn't question it. These checks happened. Everyone knew that. He nodded, bleary-eyed, and put the truck in neutral. Luis circled to the front, opened the AC intake, and quietly attached the black sedation device. He tapped the trigger in his coat pocket and began the countdown. 90 seconds. Just fog, silence, and the sound of the engine. At 3:05 a.m., Gustavo Herrera slumped unconscious against the window. Luis moved fast. Luis stepped forward in full cartel uniform, clipboard in hand, radio clipped to his shoulder. Routine inspection, he said calmly. Gustavo nodded, half asleep behind the wheel. He pulled the unconscious driver into the passenger seat, climbed behind the wheel, and drove into the darkness, taking a dirt access road mapped months earlier. 10 minutes later, he arrived at a crumbling farmhouse, barely visible from the highway, long abandoned, never recorded on satellite maps. Hidden behind the house, under a sheet of rusted tin, was a compact gray sedan, dusty, low profile, and stripped of identifying details. The license plates had been wiped clean. The trunk was already open. The money 12 waterproof plastic containers filled with $6.2 million in cartel cash was stacked in the rear of the transport truck. Luis moved with mechanical precision, hauling them out one by one and loading them into the sedan's trunk and back seat. 8 minutes and 17 seconds. That's all it took. Luis returned to the truck and began planting evidence. A confession letter forged in Mario Guerrero's handwriting, creased and yellowed. Bank records linking Carlos Vega to suspicious offshore deposits. A burner phone containing dozens of fake text messages between co-conspirators. Business cards with Fernando Silva's fingerprints. And tucked inside the glove compartment, a maintenance checklist initialed by Ricardo Morales, timestamped just 1 day before the heist. It was nothing by itself, but in a cartel investigation, proximity was guilt. Then came the final touch. Luis leaned over Gustavo's unconscious body and delivered a sharp blow to his nose with the side of his fist. Cartilage cracked, blood poured. He smeared it deliberately across the steering wheel, a perfect trace of violence. The narrative was simple. This wasn't a lone thief. This was a multi-man inside job, orchestrated by rival cartels and rogue drivers. And Gustavo? Just a survivor in the middle of a bloody betrayal. At 3:16 a.m., Luis repositioned Gustavo in the driver's seat, reattached the GPS, removed the gas device, and disappeared into the night in his gray sedan, headlights off, sticking to back roads. At 3:18 a.m., Gustavo jolted awake. No memory, no money, no idea what had happened. The perfect crime was complete. By 6:30 a.m., the cartel's operations center was in chaos. Gustavo had arrived 2 hours late, dazed, with no memory and no money. The truck was empty, except for the story Luis had planted. Mario Guerrero's handwritten confession, a burner phone full of fabricated text messages, blood on the wheel, financial records, business cards, suspicious fingerprints. At first, they thought Gustavo had double-crossed them, but the evidence told a different story, one the cartel found far more convincing. This wasn't a robbery, this was a conspiracy. Their internal task force got to work. Former military intelligence, ex-federal agents, interrogators trained to break men in hours. And Luis had given them everything they needed to believe the lie. The documents traced suspicious wire transfers to Carlos Vega. The phone showed encrypted chats between Fernando Silva and rival cartel numbers. The fingerprints on the business cards matched Ricardo Morales. And the confession, written in Mario Guerrero's hand. Within 48 hours, the cartel had issued death orders for all four: Carlos Vega, Fernando Silva, Ricardo Morales, Mario Guerrero, and somewhere in the background, the janitor who'd framed them all was already gone. What happened next was exactly what Luis had planned and exactly what would haunt him forever. Carlos Vega was found first, hiding in Guadalajara, shot dead at dawn. His only crime was falling in love with the wrong woman. Fernando Silva fled with his wife and 2 children to Guatemala. The cartel found them anyway. Executed the entire family as a message. Fernando had never stolen anything. His wife taught school. Their children were 4 and 7 years old. Ricardo Morales was captured at the U.S. border. 3 days of torture. He broke after 18 hours, confessing to crimes he'd never committed. But in his final moments, delirious with pain, Ricardo whispered something important. The janitor, always watching, always there. Then Ricardo Morales died. El Jefe, the cartel leader, had been listening. He began to wonder if they'd been looking in all the wrong places. The fourth conspirator, Mario Guerrero, was gunned down in a casino 2 nights after the heist. He was playing the slots in Jalisco when 2 men in black jackets walked in and didn't even break stride. 3 bullets to the chest. No warning, no words. 7 people died for Luis's crime. 4 drivers, 1 teacher, 2 children. All innocent. All murdered based on evidence Luis had fabricated. Meanwhile, the real perpetrator had vanished completely. At 4:42 a.m., Luis Alvarez reached the edge of the border zone, a dense stretch of forest outside Camargo, Tamaulipas, facing the Rio Grande. Just across the river was Zapata County, Texas. The sun hadn't risen yet. Fog hung low over the scrub and thorn brush. This was a smuggler's corridor, unpatrolled, unlit, forgotten by design. Luis shut off the engine of his dusty 1994 Nissan Suru, rolled it off the dirt path, and buried it under a blanket of branches and camouflage netting. Inside the trunk, 12 duffel bags, packed with $6.2 million in cartel cash. He grabbed 2 bags, slung them over his shoulders, and began walking. 8 kilometers through the trees, across the riverbed, and into southern Texas, using one of the same footpaths smugglers had used for years. No cameras, no drones, no witnesses. 2 hours later, he reached a crumbling ranch shack near Los Habanos, Texas, a structure he'd quietly rented under a false name 2 months earlier. The electricity barely worked, the walls sweated, but it was perfect. He locked the 2 bags inside, drank half a bottle of water, and turned back. Before dawn, he crossed the border again and returned to the Suru. He repeated the same route with 2 more bags. By the time the sun rose, 4 bags, nearly 1/3 of the fortune, were hidden safely in his makeshift hideout. He slept through the day, windowless and motionless. The next night, Luis did it again. 2 trips, 2 bags each. Another 4 bags moved, now 8. On the 3rd night, he slept during daylight, rose in silence, and made his final 2 trips. The last time he reached the Tsuru, he doused it in gasoline. He struck a match and tossed it. The fire swallowed the car in minutes. No license plate, no DNA, no trace. Luis turned his back on the flames and walked into the night with the final bags. 12 bags were now safe. And Luis Alvarez? He no longer existed. From now on, his name was Ricardo Salinas. 6 months later, a man named Ricardo Salinas appeared in San Antonio, Texas. Successful businessman, clean background, legitimate documentation. What his neighbors didn't know was that Ricardo Salinas was Luis Alvarez, a former janitor turned ghost, living off laundered cartel money. The transformation had taken months of precise planning. He learned the subtleties of American culture, neutralized his accent, rehearsed a complete backstory. The money was cleaned methodically through cryptocurrency tumblers, offshore proxies, and shell company investments that looked perfectly mundane on paper. He bought a modest house, a reliable used car, enrolled in community groups, paid taxes, made friends at a quiet gym. Nothing flashy, nothing memorable. A man engineered to disappear in plain sight. But invisibility had a price. At night, he thought about Fernando's children, the way Carlos's girlfriend had screamed when they dragged him away, the look in Ricardo Morales' eyes when the cartel men realized he wasn't guilty, just strange. Luis hadn't just framed them, he'd written them into a death sentence. The cartel killed for control. Luis had killed for silence. And what haunted him wasn't just the blood, it was the simplicity. The plan had worked too well. The only thread left was the money, or rather, the lack of it. That was the only thing the cartel never recovered. They had suspects, they had corpses, but they never found the $6.2 million. That was the one loose end that never got tied. The one question that still echoed through cartel war rooms. Where is the money? They never knew Luis Alvarez existed. And Ricardo Salinas never gave them a reason to look twice. The perfect crime didn't leave witnesses. It left a question, and a man who could never answer it even to himself.
Yeah, I want to see the evidence to back this up. But man, hope y'all stay to the very, very end, and I hope y'all drop a like, comment below. And yeah, stay tuned for the next one, y'all.